Welcome back to another edition of AI Insiders by AI Marketers Guild. Even if I'm wearing the shirt of our sister community today, Serial Marketers, we're all friends here, and actually great to see a lot of folks from many overlapping communities take part. And community is a great way to introduce today's speaker because he's not just someone I've learned a ton from in building the faux fraction of a fraction and executive network, but Chris Heuer is someone who I learned so much of what I know about community building from early on from his work in turning Social Media Club into a national. Was it even international at all?
Global, 350 cities around the world. Yeah.
It was an international movement, and just I mean, Chris like is like through his work and the kind of like ball that he got rolling there is just like how so many social media marketers connected early on, and so many people like, I see some folks like, like Michael, who's a client, like, they were, just, able to learn so much from what you've built. And Chris, you continue to evolve and teach and share so much. And we're really lucky to have you and your insights and experience with us today. So, welcome, and would love to hear what you're up to now.
Thanks so much, David. I appreciate it. Really great to be here and share this story with you. I will share that it is a story in progress. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in the beginning, but let me frame this a little bit better. This talk today, we're going to be talking about artificial employees and personal intelligence, and in many ways, as you'll see, personal intelligence is a different way of framing the discussion around agents and how we as individuals will use agents with a distinctly human-centric lens. We talk about human-centric AI a lot. I don't know that we see many examples. We're going to talk about how to approach this particular area of AI with that lens of creating human centricity. And, I think a lot of this comes from my lived experience. And I've actually lived through, like many of you other people with a little bit of gray hair in the audience, lived through a lot of these cycles. And really, I see four major socioeconomic transformations that I've really lived through over the years. And the first one I remember as a child sitting in the gas lines in the early 1970s. And then the other bit of that I remember is Walter Cronkite talking on the news about the shift from the manufacturing to the service economy, essentially moving from making cars to serving hamburgers in fast food restaurants, right? Then in the 80s, we saw the switch from service to information economy and what that meant with the birth of the PCs. And then we move into the 90s and we move into the sort of network economy, digital economy, if you will, enabled by the internet. And now I believe that we're in another period of socioeconomic transformation. I don't know that it has a name yet. We certainly can call it the AI era. That's how I've been talking about it. And through the Team Flow Institute, what we've been working on for the last couple of years is the nature of human work in the era of AI. And we really had envisioned how things would change. And what we have is a hypothesis that led me into researching Team Flow and building on top of the work of Dr. Jeff Vandenhout, was the realization that before we introduced AI into our organizations, that we needed to figure out how we work better together. Because too many organizations, whether it's the culture, the leadership, the structure, or just the way it is, they're not organized very well, and they're not running as efficiently as they could, and a lot of them just spit up and chew out their people. That's a broader values-based problem, I believe, that leans on the quarter-over-quarter stock market cycle that so many leaders seem to be serving instead of their people, instead of their markets. So that we know is not necessarily changing. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why we're talking about this now, because as you all have seen, I'm sure, a lot more people are looking at replacing, a lot more leaders, organizational leaders, are looking at replacing their people with AI instead of figuring out how to augment their capabilities and expand what they're doing and change how they create value. But when we look back to the history, the one thing that I really have seen here is that the pattern throughout all of this is the same. We haven't seen much talk today about the doomsayers and utopians anymore. Although, of course, the CEO of Anthropic scared all the business pundits and journalists recently with his pronouncement that, we're going to lose so much of the white class, the white collar, not white class, excuse me, the white collar professional class. is going to lose their jobs. Well, we know that's already happening. We know that in the hiring cycles right now, it's very difficult to get into a position. And of course, Shopify CEO famously said, don't hire any more people, figure out if an AI can do it and do that first. And then we saw Klarna come around and do that. And what really impressed me and what was more surprising is how quick the snapback effect was for Klarna to realize that they were measuring the wrong things. Of course, anyone who studied history could tell you this, because the original work of CRM, part of it was that we were looking at the idea of reducing time on call in order to make call centers more effective. And of course, what happened is satisfaction dropped as well. And ultimately, most companies realized that caller customer satisfaction was more important metric than the amount of time on call, and that the investment of time and human energy into that was actually value accretive to the organization itself. But when we look at this kind of doomsayer utopian view, in my experience over all these different cycles in the past 30, 40, 50 years now, since I was that young child in a gas line, we tend to overestimate the impact in the short term and underestimate the impact in the long term. So the reality is going to be somewhere in the middle. But what I've also learned is that the reality ends up being shaped by the decisions we make along the way. And so that's one of the reasons why we're focused on human work in the era of AI, because we want to emphasize how much more valuable it can be when we augment us with technology instead of replacing us. Within AI, just to throw down a little bit of bona fides here on this, look, back in the late 90s, I'm sure many of you digital marketers were doing collaborative filtering and all sorts of other ways to follow the Pepper Rogers group and do one-on-one marketing, personalization, the rest of it. That's a very early nascent form of AI. We just didn't call it that. It wasn't in that class of technology and software. But over the years since that, I spent some time as an IBM futurist. After leaving Deloitte, I was also on their social business council representing Deloitte, and that gave me a first row seat to look at Watson and get inside the IBM labs and a bunch of other places to really look at some of those early use cases and consider what will be the implications to society and the economy and what do organizations look like. I also spent some time with the Google Launchpad Accelerator, where I was the lead mentor. I got to work alongside Peter Norvig quite often, who, of course, was famously called the godfather of AI. He wrote the textbook that many students at the time, now going back 10 years, was using to actually learn AI. And that really set a lot of the tone of what's possible and, again, what people were thinking. And what I found was, again, we know in large organizations, the COOs and CFOs have a lot of the control. And they look to cost cutting as the best way to boost profits. And of course, that's just as good as going to a lawyer for business advice, because they're looking to mitigate your risk, not to expand your horizons and opportunities. That all said, in my 30 years of experience, I've correctly predicted dozens of these trends, particularly the ones that deal with society and, as David was mentioning, community elements of it. And I've learned to recognize the patterns of how these transformative technologies actually integrate into our human systems. And so with that in mind, I'm looking at this current moment of how we've been moving from an economy where human intelligence is augmented and applied through tools to one where human intelligence itself becomes the most valuable asset to be cultivated, shaped, and deployed. And the choices we make now and the economic purchasing decisions of which companies we support are going to go a long way to deciding our future. Look, this doesn't just need to be about AI taking our jobs. It could be about something far more profound. And in this emergence of what I've now come to call personal intelligence, it can be a new form of an economic asset that you will own, control, and deploy throughout your career. It won't only just help you to be a better you, but it will help you to generate income, and in fact, could generate income on its own, even while you're sleeping for you. So as we start looking at this, there's a lot of risk we talk about inside of this and things that are outside of our control. But particularly for leaders in marketing organizations and across the organization, the deeper risk today is asking the wrong questions and architecting the wrong systems. And of course, from my perspective, asking who can we get rid of versus who can we actually augment and how can we approach this to take advantage of this technology in a different way is part of the better question we could be asking.
And and Chris, I don't want to cut you up, but I just like
Please.
it's also where you know I like to talk about bias where it's not just of AI and with actually Catherine Montgomery in the room who's done some great research on that. I think we'll come back and talk more about that soon. But also there's so much bias in terms of how we choose to use it and how we want to use it. And to me, that's like so important in terms of like setting intention and being clear with like your team and maybe your board and other constituents saying like because bias shapes so much of that, right? And like we all have it, and it could be for growth, it could be for cutting costs, or or wherever we want,
Yeah, and again, it's all geared by our experiences, right? And how things are introduced to us. So as leaders here in AIMG and people taking AI back to the rest of the organization, how we think and how we talk about this technology is really important, because those first touches that, everyday people have when they come into AI is going to determine their view of it as they go forward. We already know that a lot of people, particularly employees in organizations, are returning to hoarding their information because they're fearful that they're trading their replacement, and that replacement's going to be an AI. And with that decrease in trust and psychological safety, you're not getting the best performance out of your teams and your people. So literally the first principle of saying that we are going to use AI to augment us instead of replace us, and standing by that sort of approach, is going to lead to a little loosening of that fear so that people can embrace and imagine the possibilities. And that's where at Team Flow Institute, one of the assets we've created, and I can send this to you later if you're interested, is a guide called Conversations for Action into Ethical or Responsible AI Integration. And it's about the conversations we need to have with our teams before we get into a massive organization-wide AI transformation. Now, I'm not just talking about using Midjourney to try to create some images and run some marketing copy and some of the basic stuff, but I'm looking at more wide-scale implementations across the company. But let me just focus on what I'm looking at here with personal intelligence again for a moment, because what I've got, I think of it really as a vision that is beyond this focus on just agents. It is, again, in some ways reframing agents, but it's also more. When you add these components of the vision and this idea that you can own your personal intelligence as an asset that you can then license to others, whether that's licensing it to your employer as part of your employment agreement, licensing it to organizations or teams that you never even human interact with, or using it as part of a client engagement to make yourself accessible to the client 24/7 at a low fidelity level to then facilitate a further conversation. I believe it's an incredibly it's an incredible opportunity to be able to actually take your experiences, your wisdom, your learning, your digital exhaust, your data, and to curate it into something that is much, much more than what you're getting with just using Claude or just using any other AI agent on its own. And we'll talk more about those distinctions in a little bit. But let me start by showing you a little model. It's a pretty crappy graphic. But hey, what do you know? Gemini can produce HTML5 style layouts that form infographics, right? And I want to put this in framing because really having a framework to understand all the different levels, I think, is going to be very helpful here. And the core of it all is our human intelligence. It's our contextual awareness of the world. It's all of our individual experiences. Whereas personal intelligence is something that we curate. Now, of course, GPT now, if you're using it properly in the settings, you can tell it how you want to respond. It remembers your prior conversations, and it's actually building a form of your personal intelligence on your own for you. Sorry. But in that way, you don't own that. They own that. It's improving GPT. And yes, it's serving to your benefit. So I'm doing it, I'm using it, and I don't mind too much on that. But there's another form of it that you can curate and put together that we can do more with. And that's the personal intelligence, which is the next stack up. And it can be used in many different ways, and we'll get into that in a bit. But also beyond the human intelligence is our emotional intelligence, which is the ability to regulate our self-awareness and our emotions and have that awareness of how we are in the world with others. And then I look at that beyond that as the next level of relational intelligence, which is how we interact and relate with others. And in this way, a really important component of it is this philosophy that we really advocate for called co-elevation, which is the idea that we want the other people in our orgs, on our teams to be better off. Why? Because if they're better off, I'm going to be better off. Co-elevation, another way of talking about the rising tide. Beyond that, we look at the team intelligence itself, because I do have an organizational and team lens on this as well. And ultimately, the idea is how do we roll up all of the individuals' human intelligence into the broader organizational intelligence to make the organization itself smarter, more effective, and so let the left hand know what the right hand's doing, as so many people say around this, right? But within that framework, as we start looking at this, what we're really going to see is how the human intelligence is the foundation in the development of the personal intelligence becomes the atomic unit of all higher level intelligences. And in this way, again, as I've been reinforcing again and again, an asset that you can deploy inside your organization. Now, there's some current risk with that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But before I get into that, let me start with a request. I'd really like to ask you if you believe in sort of this element of human-centric AI or this approach of human-centric AI and the rest of this, that I ask that you make 3 commitments. That number 1, you think about it as humans plus AI, not humans versus AI. And of course, if you don't know about it already, Ross Dawson has a great community called Humans Plus AI that talks about a lot of these topics in deep detail. The other thing that I ask you to think about, particularly those of you who are responsible for other people on your teams or in your organizations, that you approach systemic transformation with human dignity, to actually redesign the roles, workflows, and your organizational culture to capture AI's speed and scale without dehumanizing the organization and the people who build it. The other commitment here is to look at the opportunity that is personal intelligence as a focal point, to look at the opportunity for you as a leader, as well as for your people, to package your data, voice, and intent as a controllable asset. And in that way, my approach to personal intelligence is a practical mechanism that lets us honor all of these commitments without the trade-offs, and it leads to a brighter day after tomorrow, which we'll also talk about here in a little bit. Now, I'm in the process now, and the reason for giving this talk right now is I'm in the process of compiling a book on this subject, and it includes a little bit of the vision, a little bit of the practicality. I've started working on a market map of the technologies that's not ready yet. But it came about because about 2 months ago, one of my research fellows came to me with wanting to do a talk on AI as a teammate. And this is something that's happening much quicker than I imagined. Again, we started Team Flow Institute now almost 2 years ago with this idea in mind. But to see that companies are already deploying AI as parts of a team, and not considering a lot of the other human factors or sociological and psychological impact is a little bit concerning. As I started looking out in the world and looking at this idea of AI as teammates, the phrasing of what do we call it came to mind. And so it turns out, after doing a little survey on LinkedIn, the digital twin is the predominant choice for what to call this sort of thing. And that's really inspired by what Reid Hoffman did on his book tour with Reid AI, and how he sent his Reid AI out to do podcasts and other interviews, and was able to pretty much pull it off. And a lot of people couldn't tell the difference. And in large part, that's because they spent a lot of money curating all of his speeches, all of his text, all of his data, and structuring that into an AI-ready data set that produced a higher fidelity level version of this personal intelligence than you or I could likely do on our own. Unless we have, a team of, I don't know how many people went into that. I'd love to study that more. And if anyone knows the people who did that for Reid, please help me with an introduction, because I do want to get that more. But the side effect of it was that it anthropomorphized, it turned it into more of a human character as opposed to a tool or a piece of technology. And that ends up being bad for a number of reasons. It's also kind of one of these things, it's half a dozen of one, six of the other. There's good and bad in it. But I wanted to look at how do we intentionally consider what we call this, as opposed to just falling into what became the popular mainstream view of these things as digital twins. Because there's a lot of other uses besides putting it out there as our agent to answer questions or serve as a 24/7 duplicate of what my intelligence might be. And in that way, even as we start looking at it, there is a need for curating it into faceted identities. So how do we deploy our personal intelligence within our organization, within our church or community group, within our family, on our website, acting as a sort of avatar on our behalf, as a first point of contact for people, to where we could even be having it out there booking speeches for us and talking to conferences as a first line of interview for conferences to go off and determine, should I ask this person to come and speak at my event? So I went through all the different references. Some people call them avatars. Some people call them personal intelligence assistants or personal intelligence agents. But what we really wanted to do was guard against over anthropomorphizing this, as I said before. But I landed on this personal intelligence along with Jamie Schwartz, who's also on this call and is my co-founder for the Team Flow Institute, because a couple of reasons. First of all, it connected to the intelligence stack, as I've showed you. So it fits within line with the framework of how we look at the other aspects that we're talking about here, particularly as it ladders up to organizational intelligence, so that we can really talk to the large enterprises to get their input on this and to have them support this a bit more. But it also scales across the different contexts and use cases as we can talk about it. And it's also distinct from the artificial intelligence because it's based on my human intelligence, not just this broad amalgamation of LLMs, cognition, and broader data sets. It is unique and it is more focused. And in many ways, it picks up on our stylings and our tone and the biases that David was mentioning earlier and our inclinations. And what we really have to look at inside of this is that what people hear is an unintended bias. And so how we choose our language and how we reflect it is an intentional opportunity to shape the future of how other people see and talk about and consider this. So I think it's very important in many ways. So let me switch into a little bit more to talk about what I mean by personal intelligence and the core capabilities of it. And again, in many ways, it's a reframing of what we've been doing with personal agents in that way, but it's with greater curation of the data and the digital exhaust of our lives, and it can be so much more in that way. Of course, we do have it as a sort of chatbot. In fact, you can find mine. I'll put it in the link here later, but I created one at delphi.com/Chris Heuer. And this was just basically a cloud suck of all the documents and writings and things that I could find, and turning a complete ingestion of my whole personal blog that I haven't updated in God knows how long. But in that way, it picked up a lot of extraneous data. There's posts in there like the pick of the day or an old tweet about having a problem with US airlines that doesn't exist anymore, right? So why are we feeding that stuff to it? Well, it's real easy. So I was able to get Delphi up and running pretty quickly. Contrast that with a different approach by a company called Purifina. I'll also share that link with you later. And Purifina has a much more considered approach where I could not just connect to via a cloud multi-connect tool, but where I had to curate all of the information, not only down to text files, but also to restructure the data in each of those text files to be more focused. And in this way, we're actually following the basic principles of computer that we used to call GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. And in that way, getting a more AI-ready data set that's structured and focused on what really matters. Not all this extraneous stuff. Look, that does things like decrease compute time, but it produces a higher fidelity response. So the more effort we put into curating the data that feeds our personal intelligence, the greater the sort of impact we will feel when we're working with it ourselves as a collaboration partner or as a sounding board or just to solve that blank page problem in writing a new post or getting a plan together. And the greater the opportunity it will be for deploying it as an asset that will actually generate income for us in the future. We'll get into all the use cases because most of them as being involved with AI, but I want to talk about one in particular. which is the opportunity to create a version of the personal intelligence for the CMO or for other leaders in your organization. And in fact, in this way, one of my friends who is a senior partner at a mid-sized consulting firm who I was talking to recently told me that for every pitch to any public company over the last several years, they have been creating agents or versions of this that are ingesting all of the public statements, writings, and commentary of the leaders that they're pitching in various organizations, of course, using only publicly available material. But even that gets to enough fidelity where they can practice their pitch, where they can propose a given idea or make a given point and see how the AI responds to it. Now, in the same way they're doing this externally to help with their sales to executives of public companies, you can use a version of this internally to actually create one of your CMO and actually pose the proposed questions for projects, ideas, and other things you want and get the feedback before you actually take it to them. Now, of course, this is a lower fidelity version. All the experiences of waking up on the wrong side of the bed in the morning changes how the actual presentation goes, right? But what we can look at here is a getting closer to it. And this is why working with any of these sorts of agents or personal intelligence requires a level of what I call calibrated trust. We have to understand that these personal intelligences, whether it's the CMO or if it's one of our teammates that's attending a meeting, listening in because they couldn't be there, it is actually not necessarily completely up to date, nor does it have all of the data and information that we need in it today. And we have to measure, like, how much can we actually trust and rely on this information versus when do I need to go to the actual human behind it to get the most current stuff and to get this information validated. I think we all kind of know that innately, but it's a really important thing to teach people, which is why this concept of calibrated trust is something that I'll be writing about more in the weeks. And certainly it'll be a section in the book in and of itself as we start looking at this stuff. I mentioned the meeting proxy component. We've got AIs in this meeting right now. I don't know if we have any attending on behalf of people who can't be here right now, but that all happens a lot. In fact, I'm sure many of you have been in meetings where there's more meeting bots recording transcripts than there are actual humans, right? This isn't what I'm talking about when I say personal intelligence attending a meeting. This is the next generation beyond that. And in this way, it's about actually how do we pre-think what it is that needs to go into that meeting, and how do we send a version of our personal intelligence as our proxy that will listen to the meeting through our lens. Now, you can actually do things like this right now with Fireflies, for instance, because Fireflies allows you to set system-level prompts in the back-end configuration settings on how you want it to review certain meetings. So you could actually do a minor version of this right now, but I think that the technology that I'm envisioning is still in development mostly, and I haven't seen a good version of this. Because part of the idea of your personal intelligence attending the meeting on your behalf isn't just to answer questions and to be there to represent your expertise and what have you, but it's to come back with a more concentrated report on the things that really matter to me. In fact, taking our structured data insights into this sort of thing, one of the things that might be necessary as we go forward isn't just the structured meeting agenda up front so that we can actually produce a transcript that is an AI-ready data set, but is a RACI chart for what are the responsibilities, accountabilities, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the C and the I again. Interest and concern. There we go. I think that's what it is. Concerned party, interested party. I screwed it up. I'm sorry. RACI isn't my expertise, but I do believe that there's some role for it. And in this way, we're going to end up getting more of our time back, right? That's one of the core reasons. Today, actually, as you all experience, I have more work to do because of the AI. Like even in putting this presentation together over the last week, I've got four or five versions of this presentation that I've done with different narrative outlines, and trying to weave them all together and synthesize it is a really difficult process. It took, literally dozens of hours. It didn't just do it all for me and a staff. Why? Because it still doesn't get the contextualization of the reasoning and the inference and the deeper insights that I'm trying to apply. And it always has to be shaped and corrected a bit. It does a great job on getting that blank page filled, But ultimately, we have to choose what parts of that blank page that were filled with stuff that's meaningful that we want to choose to convey with others. Um, but let me get to as I want to close up here in the next few minutes, and I've got hundreds of more minutes of stuff I could talk to you about. But I want to talk about the distinction a little bit more between artificial employees and personal intelligence. I've said this a lot, and I keep emphasizing it on purpose, not because of the fact that an AI wrote this for me and it repeats itself, as you know, is a common problem that we get with it. But the real difference between artificial employee is it's a generic AI agent purchased by companies. It can be more powerful in some ways. But that's not the only reason why we're wanting to use this or make this choice. The personal intelligence, as it becomes an employee intelligence, it creates both an opportunity and a real threat. In today's world, the employment agreement that you signed with your employer, if you have one and you work for a company and aren't a contractor, states that they own pretty much everything that you create while you're there. It's a default language. You don't really have a chance to negotiate it. That's just the standard position. Of course, they do that for intellectual property reasons, for patents, and many other purposes, NDAs, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality means that they could today suck up all the documents you've created, all the emails that you've written, everything that you've produced as part of the company, and create a version of your personal intelligence in some way and fire you, saying, I've got all the information I need about John and Debbie. They've shared it all with me. I own it already. So why should I keep paying them? Well, the reason why is very simple in my view. And we can talk about the ethics of it and we can talk about the other components of it. But ultimately, for me, this comes down to a lesson we learned from Henry Ford at the birth of the assembly line. And that was the need for my employees to be able to afford to buy my car. And if we are to move in this direction of artificial employees, instead of recognizing and respecting human work and the ability of that human work to be transformed into a personal intelligence that becomes part of the organizational intelligence for which individuals deserve to be compensated, I think we're going to be in a really difficult situation that leads us to more of a dystopian instead of a utopian view on this whole thing. So I think you know a lot about what I'm looking at in personal. In agents, in terms of how we use personal agents. As we look at this opportunity here, what I really see with this personal intelligence is something that is akin to what we've seen with the NCAA and also all college sports, I guess, and that's in the name, image, likeness sort of view. If you're familiar with anything that's gone on there, college athletes can now get paid millions of dollars just for having their name, image, and likeness in a commercial, in a video game, anywhere else, and they control that as rights. I believe that the PIL, the personal intelligence license, will be the NIL equivalent for knowledge workers. And again, this is why I keep repeating about the fact that it becomes an asset you own and therefore something that's worthy of your curation. Of course, we do have a challenge in this, which is, as I said earlier, the COOs and CFOs are looking to cut costs, and they don't really care about people all the time. As I've said for the past 25 years or so, CFOs look at the spreadsheets in the same way that Plato's man in the cave famously looked at the shadows on the wall, believing that they're real, instead of understanding that they're just shadows of a deeper reality. And we have to start looking at what that reality is and what the right opportunity is. And while the short term is that cost cutting on this, our longer term value creation is more important. And ultimately, it's not just about tomorrow or today. It's about the day after tomorrow and having a need to understand the impacts of our decisions that we're making as we start integrating AI into our work lives and into our organizations beyond this stuff. Again, I've got a lot more to share on this stuff, but let me just move here to closing so we can take some questions. In this way, coming up a level, looking at economic lens for a moment here. We've long talked about three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Of course, many people can add data to that, so we can look at it in that sense. But I believe that actually personal intelligence is a much more concrete form of a factor of production economically after land, labor, and capital. It is a generic term, of course, in some ways, that needs to be defined. So that's why I'm working on a book behind this. That's why I want to get battered by questions on it. And how we can actually make this happen is going to be a rough road ahead in many ways. But I know from living through all these different cycles over the years that there's always bright spots, and that there's always some small group of people, whether or not it becomes a mainstream thing or not, there's some small group of people who buy into this and adopt this way of thinking and start working on it together. And that's kind of what I'm inviting you all into today, is to help me co-create a sort of movement around personal intelligence and how we can reconsider how we're integrating AI into our teams and into our work environments, so that the AI technology remains as a tool instead of being seen as a human equivalent, because it's not. It is a set of data that is wrapped in a cognitive compute layer that is accessible primarily for most of us right now through a chat interface. Of course, we'll see that through multiple other interfaces. It will attend meetings on our behalf, where our personal intelligence one day could be me, a version of me, an avatar of me on a video screen, even delivering this presentation. And in fact, I looked into doing that so that I didn't screw up all the little pieces in between, because there's a lot of material that I wanted to present, and I wanted to present it properly. But at the end of the day, that's not just there yet in an easily accessible manner. And that gets into a whole other thing beyond this stuff. But if this is of interest to you at all, I really encourage you to reach out to me. You can email me at chris@tfi.email. Yes, that is .email. It is an actual domain. I thought that was cool, so I bought that for us, or the TFI, Team Flow Institute. I'd love to talk to you more about how you're implementing it on your teams. I'm looking for case studies to include in my book. I'm looking for technologies that you're deploying that enable this, and to better understand how people are actually using it, and to understand how people want to use it, so that we can actually influence the direction of the technology. Because as early adopters and influencers that we are, as members of this group and this community, we do have that capability. We do have a lot of power. And I'd really like to work with you to harness it so that we can make the day after tomorrow a better day for all. Thank you.
Thanks.
If you could share the link to your chatbot you mentioned in your talk.
Yes, thank you. I'll go get that and put that in the chat now.
It's really powerful, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. So where am I wrong? I know a lot of places could be wrong, but some of it's just going to take time. But I'd love to hear some.
Start with Lisa to see where you're right or wrong. So,
I think you're right. In broad terms, that was great. Thank you. But what came to mind as I was listening, especially when you talked about your own personal experience, or Reid Hoffman's, people who have a body of work out there to ingest, is that there's going to be a digital divide between the people who do and the people who don't. And I think too about young people whose output is like TikTok videos, right? And not, discursive blog posts about their work. How you see that evolving. And I would say too, like, much of the work that I've produced in my career I no longer have, right? It was for organizations that I worked for. So I'm not out there as a public thinker the way you are. So maybe you could talk about that.
Oh, that's a really great point, Lisa. Thank you very much for bringing it up. I wrote about this somewhat in a post that on my LinkedIn profile around something called The Loop. And it was a different way to look at decentralized AI and having that human-centric values. But it was about individuals coming together and co-curating around a topic. And in this way, the organization, the community, or as I like to think of it, a guild, would have its own AI that would also be a licensable asset. So it's not something that you necessarily is only you. It could be you and a group of people that you are aligned with, whether that's spiritually, intellectually, professionally, wherever that might be. But certainly what it requires, even of me, is that better curation. In that Delphi link, again, I've gotten wrong answers about my wife because, two posts, the language that I wrote on a blog post in 2009 versus 2014, slightly different. It wasn't angry or anything. It was just different context and stuff. And it's about actually the curation process more than anything else. So while I have a head start in having whatever hundreds of hours of audio and documents and other stuff, you can catch up, and it is possible. And in many ways, as I see this, part of it is going to be, and this gets a little thorny, but I also think about the things that I've read, right? So how can I ingest the things that I've got in my Flipboard, in my bookmarks list on my browser, if that's where I keep things organized, and to consider the stuff I've read as much as the stuff I've written, as much as the stuff I've commented on. So I don't think that we have an easy solution, particularly giving some of the differences in the generational context, and certainly, younger generation today is at a disadvantage. In the longer term, especially in the short term, they're more advantaged because they can be hired cheap, and the cheap people are still getting hired versus people who have more experience. But we'll see that our ability with the wisdom and experience that we've captured enables us to deploy and interact with these technologies better because we have a contextual understanding of how to put it together in a way that they don't, because we've already been through all that work. And I'm more concerned that those kids won't have a job to learn these things along the way than I'm worried about where their thought leadership is coming from or the rest of it. But it is a really good point, and we definitely need to address it. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
I have a question and a comment. So my question is, how are you adding your content to your chatbot? What's your process?
Well, so for the Delphi one, it's literally a multi-cloud select. I mean, literally you connect to your Google Drive, your OneDrive, your blog, social media streams, or other things, and it just ingests it all. Quran, for those of you who don't know, has a great curation tool. I saw this in the direction that I've been thinking about now for decades, and he's done a terrific job with integrating that as a WordPress plugin and going beyond that. And so having a tool to specifically curate is one of the key things that Quran's tool offers. And so that's another opportunity for you to go take a look at what he's doing and see if that's something that can help you as well.
And then the comment that I wanted to make is, what you're talking about context, to really understand the limitations of AI and how it doesn't always get your intention is to create your own knowledge base and then start asking questions. When you go to a GPT and you ask questions, it takes the whole internet, and you really don't have a concept of what you really wanted to do. You see the limitations when you have your own knowledge base, and then you start asking and starting to work with that content to really understand. And it's key. If you're, as marketers, I really encourage you, you need to do this in order for you to really understand the strengths and the weaknesses of these AI systems.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, and so look, one of the best use cases for this, and I actually have a couple of friends who are working on this directly, this application of it, which is as this sort of self-reflected version of me to be my higher level consciousness. And that's not just for the brainstorming and the, hey, did I phrase this right, sort of collaborative writing that we do with it, that considers all of the past memories that I might not even be able to recall in a given moment while I'm working on something else. So I think that I don't know if this is the right phrase, but I've been thinking about this a lot too, Karan. Is it intrapersonal? It's the internal dialogue that we're able to have externalized. And in that way, it can allow us to achieve and reach higher levels of our own self through that reflection of self-awareness. Of course, we still need to be worried about bias. We need to be worried about the programmers and engineers who put it together and the control lines that they've put into it and everything else. But this is again why we're looking, and I'm working with another group who's forming a federation of human-centric AI organizations to really advance and organize the companies who have committed to it, perhaps even in the same way that the B Corp has to social responsible companies.
I want to add something. So yesterday I found out about multi-prompting MPC framework where you use AI agents to create multiple prompts that go through a process. So, and then I realized that Curator and KChat do exactly the same thing with the human intervention. You can create multiple prompts. So when you're on the content, you can apply the prompt to the content that you're saving And then your chatbot has another prompt that applies it to the contents, whether you want to write something or whether you want to ask it questions. So now you always have the human factor in the process of multi-prompting in order to generate the results that you want. So you don't just give it to the machine, but you stay in the process of creating that end product.
Yeah, and of course, right now, when you see GPT or Claude or Gemini or any of the others thinking, that's what they're doing for you. They're literally going through the multi-prompt staging process. And, there is an 80-20 rule in a lot of this stuff, where a lot of it is common next step, next question. But the most important thing really in taking away is the real power, and our power is in the power of questions. And that means that in today's world, and particularly, we're focusing on this. We're doing a research project with the Association of National Advertisers. It's coming up and should be released in the fall. We'll tell you all about that because I definitely want your participation in it. But is a closer look at, oh my God, I totally lost my train of thought. I'm going to stop that. I got to 5 other things because I started thinking about the NA survey and how great it's going to be to present the results. But we're really looking at the idea. Oh, it's gone. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to skip to the next one. Do we have any more questions? I see Jack. Thank you for coming, Jack. I see your question in here. I'll answer that in a minute, unless we've got somebody live here that has something else really quick.
I can't find out how to raise my hand. Can I ask a quick question?
Yes,
Sure.
please, David.
Hey, Chris, you look so much older than the last time I saw you.
Damn it. I was supposed to look the same after 25 years.
Maybe my eyes are going, so that's why. There are 3 things going on here. There's what's happening in my head, what's happening in your head, and then what's going on between us. How are you rectifying these 3 different stories structurally? How are you aligning it, allowing us to orchestrate these? Is there a methodology for that? Is there a common ground? Is it breakout sessions? Tell me about that community element of this whole thing.
I'm going to make a reference and then I'm going to ask a clarifying question. So what you're getting at is actually really well expressed in one of Don Miguel Ruiz's book called The Mastery of Love. And it talks about, of course, love, relationships between couples and partners. And it talks about the person I think I am, the person you think you are, the person I think you are, the person you think I am, the person I really am, and the person you really are. And the 6 people in every relationship, right? So this is a much deeper question, and I can think of applying and answering what you're asking about, David, in a multitude of ways. So in what context or application are you trying to discern how to deal with these relational differences?
Well, we're talking about these are marketers mostly on this call. That's the mindset, and we're not only orchestrating our team and our content, but we're dealing with multiple different dynamic streams of decisions that need to be made automatically and need to be made with humans, and so again, there's not just 6 relationships, there's 6 people in the relationships for every single customer. And if you have a million customers, well, you do the math.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the reasons why, at the end of the day, marketers are always looking for silver bullets and oversimplifying things, because the complexities of it get to a point where it, increasing or decreasing returns and trying to solve for the complexities of it. Look, what it comes down to for me is greater personal development, self-awareness, and emotional intelligence. And by developing that further, we can have that greater awareness and consideration of others. One of the greatest losses we've had in the last 10 years or so has been the loss of consideration for other people. And we see that every day at the grocery store. We certainly see it online in the stupid arguments we have with each other. I've certainly been caught up and angry and said stupid shit online that I didn't really want to say, but I was angry and I said that. So learning to self-regulate and to be more aware is really the core of it. That's one of the reasons why I started moving beyond just looking at team flow, with the team being the atomic unit of value creation inside of an organization, and understanding that we have to move from the self to the system. And we have to have people who are well developed and are coming whole, just like in a romantic relationship, before they can actually really contribute their best to a team or to an organization in this way. And, so how do we actually develop our people run our teams, and build our organization. We can't just look at any one facet of it. We have to take a more holistic view. And so that's really what I'm arguing and advocating for, that we take that more holistic view and that we bring intention to each of these decisions. Now, I think you're also getting at another matter here, which is actually disagreement. And of course, we always have this idea that the ideal is to disagree but commit. But in reality, that's really hard. We still see some people who aren't so high emotional intelligence act with malfeasance and subterfuge in pretending to agree and then undermining efforts inside teams. It doesn't happen as much, I hope, but I've certainly seen it over the years. But ultimately, we have to get aligned. And that's actually where I really love this team flow framework. I'm not going to get into why I love it from my time at Deloitte, but everything I learned at Deloitte led me to this certain set of beliefs that are reflected in the team flow model. And I'll give it to you in just a minute. It starts with a collective ambition. This is more than just purpose driven. This is about your values, vision, and mission embodied. How do we actually live it? How do we bring it to life? From there, we're really looking at having audacious team goals, something that's inspiring, a bit of a stretch goal. But we also have to align our personal goals with the team goals, with the collective ambition. And more importantly, we can't just write it on a slide once a year. We have to revisit it and connect with our why more regularly, a la Simon Sinek and so many others. What it also requires is actually the ability to have open communication. So leaders need to model open communications so that we can show some level of vulnerability, that it's okay to not know all the answers, those sorts of things. And in that way, we're modeling and creating an environment of psychological and sociological safety. We can then go ahead and actually make mutual commitments to one another where we have each other's back. And then what we really need to figure out is what you're good at, what I'm good at, and be honest about it. So coming in whole with integrity, higher emotional intelligence is essential for organizations and teams to work better together. But again, it comes back to you as an individual, and that really means having a growth mindset. And remembering now what I was going to say about the ANA comment earlier, one of the core tenets of the whole thing that we believe is necessary for all individuals, whether you work in a small business on your own or in a large organization, is to have more adaptability. Technology is changing so fast. As you all know, I've been using this AI technology. I'm using it completely different today than I did a month ago. Then a month before that, then a month before that. It's changed 100 times since we've started using it. So what does it really require? It requires critical thinking, and it requires curiosity. And through that, we're enabled to accent and illuminate our creativity of how we're developing new ideas and how we're presenting them. But if we don't do that with emotional intelligence, and if we don't add in a relational intelligence of how to interact with you with respect, it's not going to work, and you're not going to produce the results that you're seeking.
So there's a responsibility, right, that we individually have. And then this conversation is about the responsibility for the systems, the automation systems that we want to build to automate whatever percent, is it 20, 30, 40, 70%, to make sure it adheres to this fact that compromise is success, and critical thinking is not me versus you. So I love this conversation, and I think it's important for us to kind of curate the future like Quran is helping us do.
Now, I'm going to add one last thing here, and I'm going to try to get to Jack's question really briefly, but just adding to this, one thing that I found when I do co-founder coaching, because I do a lot of mentorship with executive leadership teams at startups and stuff, was actually about the decision-making process. And oftentimes when you've got 3 startup founders, one of them has some more power in the dynamics of the whole thing and kind of pushes their decisions through and everything. That ends up with discord, and the organizations and startups typically fail in those sorts of environments. So being able to decide what is the basis of our decision up front, and then to look at that objectively and to create an objective framework for making those decisions is really paramount. And so it's just a different approach to your decision making and being transparent. And in fact, I did this with Aligned, a company that I formed, where I would sometimes just say, look, we don't have enough data to make a good decision on this. So we need to test something. We can't sit here waiting for all the data to be in. So let's go do this thing, test it, see how it turns out, and we can revisit this and iterate from there. David, I see we're at time, but if I could just, can I answer Jack's question, or should I do that separately?
Answer it, and then people can heal up. It's fine.
Well, I think I got to a little bit of the question here about how team flow can be harnessed to cultivate collective creativity and resilience. But the leadership practices that are essential, there's a bunch of practices, and I talked to some of them in the team flow model. And again, I think that's actually a string theory in many ways of the things that I've read in so many other books. I'm not going to cite all the books, but you can look at that in some of our work. What it really comes down to is a mindset. And it needs to be a mindset of valuing our people. And people have always said, human resources are our most valuable asset. Well, we all know it's bullshit and they're paying lip service to it, right? We need to really mean that. And so for those organizations who really care about their people, we can look at AI as producing a dividend that will reduce the amount of busy work that they need to do. And with that reduction, perhaps take their workload from 120% of capacity down to 80% of capacity. And that would mean that we can reinvest that 20% dividend in their well-being and in figuring out how they work well with the rest of their team and how the organizational system as a whole is designed so that we can iterate and fix it and find those frictions and new value opportunities to change and improve it for the future.
That's great, Chris. Thank you for all this. It's so thoughtful, and I'm more excited for you to have even more opportunities to make it actionable and put this into practice so we can learn from some of the companies we're working with. It is tremendous. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to seeing some of you later at Marketers Guild events this evening. Chris, such a treat to always get to learn from you. Thank you for your generosity, and look forward to seeing all of you here next week. Check Luma/AMG. We got a lot of great programming ahead, so it's be a fun stretch coming up.